Hello, and welcome to the second episode of the second season of It's Going to Be All Right.
2 for 2.
2 for 2 equals 4? No, not this time. My name is Niklas Minterovic.
And I'm Clayton Gwen.
And today we are talking about sources.
All sorts of sources. Kilde. That's
Kilder, ja.
the Norwegian word of the day. Kilde. Source. Or doesn't it also translate to spring? Like a water spring?
It does,
Yeah.
it does. The source of something,
Yeah.
right? That's where the Norwegian word kilde comes from.
Mm-hmm.
So something could be the source of something. It's very similar in a way.
So academic sources, scientific sources.
Or sources in general.
Generally,
what is
yeah.
it?
What are they? Why are they important? Why do we need them? Why do we use them? And what can we teach you about ways that you can be better to figure out what is useful, what isn't useful, and what is, in the air quotes of Donald Trump, fake news.
Fake news.
That's a
lot of things are fake news.
And I think for us as academics, as researchers, working in these sorts of environments, we especially need to be on guard for this sort of fake news, sources of information which are outright disingenuous, lies, falsifications, or gross misrepresentations of reality or the truth.
Just a funny thing here, talking about fake news. If you look at like a sculpture of Julius Caesar, do you think he looked like that?
Yeah, that's hard to know.
Probably didn't. You know, if you see a lot of the classical paintings, there was kings and queens and all sorts of rich people that ordered a painter to make a painting. Do you think he would paint them looking all inbred, which they probably did?
I mean, some of them look pretty bad, but there's stylings and all sorts of things. Now, I'm going to preface...
That's fake news.
Yeah, I'm going to preface this with that I'm pulling on a source that would not be considered academic or scholarly, but are you familiar with the TV show The Crown? The Crown, no. My girlfriend was really into it. She loves the costume dramas. But to answer that, and this is why I think it's important that you inform people where you're getting certain information from. In that show, there was an episode, one of the few that I'd actually sat down and watched with her, where this exact thing is going on. Do people in history look this sort of way? Where Queen Elizabeth, who's the protagonist of the show, is talking with an art dealer, an art collector, something like that, in his relationship with Buckingham Palace. But he had a line in there that was basically, behind every painting is sort of there are two men in every picture in these historic paintings. There is the artist's kind of true representation, and when shown to the person that they were doing the portrait of, very often it was an unflattering image. And so underneath these paintings that we see, there can actually be a second image that is closer to the true representation. Anyways, don't quote me on that.
They had to sneak it in.
Yeah,
they had to sneak it in.
Don't quote me on that. Maybe if you're, an art history major or scholar or something, there's probably publications on it. But go for it.
But I heard another story about, I think that was when I was in university, and I had about the ancient religions in the Middle East. And we were talking about the Egyptian hieroglyphs. And he was like, okay, so if you look at this specific hieroglyph, or not hieroglyph, but like a full story. And it was a story about the Egyptians, I think they were at war with some other nation. And they had kind of exaggerated their victory. Like there was millions of them and we slaughtered them all with ease. It was no problem. Like all the historical documents that has arrived from that time that says anything about this particular battle says something completely different. It was like 10,000 people maybe, and they didn't really crush them. It was more like it was pretty even.
Yeah. And so that all of these sorts of things, it's so wrapped up in the stories that we tell ourselves. And I think you and I like to take that perspective when it comes to communicating science, that it's all about the narrative that you spin. And so I thought that it's really good to sit and preface a lot of what a source is and why it's important and how you use it and the context you pull it from and the context you're using it in, and the importance of evaluating where it comes from to sort of gauge the truth, the validity, the reliability, the credibility of it. And so I just wanted to bring up an article. It was from 2014, but it recently circulated around on a social media site that I'll periodically go to, just for laughs, mostly, seeing goofy things that people are posting up. Anyways, it was just a screenshot of this article's title, in which case the title of this article was, "When He Says No, Denying a Woman Sex is Rape." And the main argument, I actually was like, okay, what is this? You've piqued my interest, and I will go and see this, because the comments to this photo are just, they're just crazy, of course, people going off in all sorts of different directions. And it's like, well, has anybody in this comment section bothered to find this article and read it? So I read it, and from its like very superficial, surface level reading, the article is basically an argument from like a radical feminist standpoint, saying that if women want to have sex and a man denies having sex with her, it's called rejection rape. And it was just like radical. It was incredibly radical, and it was, it kind of got on my nerves a little bit too. Like, what kind of idea is this? And as the article went on and on, I started to like pluck out some things from it that were like, okay, if anybody had read this, they'd probably see some sort of like illogical jumps that are being made in this. And so then that got me thinking, like, okay, these sorts of things get spread super quickly because people read things at a superficial level. They don't really investigate it. They don't necessarily critically read through. And there are just things in this story that didn't seem to add up. So I went and just researched, okay, well, where is this actually being published? And it's coming from a journal, like an online, not a scientific journal, but like a youth culture magazine called Thought Catalog. And you can actually go, and if you scroll over the name of the author at the top, you can click on it, and this author, Anna Gus, it takes you to all of their postings and a short little bio. And when you click on that and read the bio of the author, it says, and I quote, "Anna Gus is a male satire writer and bodybuilder living in Sweden." But this whole article is predicated as a piece of satire around like this to basically create like a straw man argument against in extremely radical feminist ideals. And when you read that, then you start to understand the joke behind it. It's incredibly facetious. It's designed to be something that's going incredibly provocative, offensive, to get people to start talking. But the thing is, it's just fake. It's not real. The whole story has been fabricated, but people circulate this around as if it is some piece of evidence that they can use to justify a stance.
And imagine people including that in their Instagram story, right? Because people have a tendency to put in quotes and, click this to get directly to the article or someone else's profile or something like that.
Exactly. So where does this lead us? Because if I hadn't have done any of that research, the whole 5 or 10 minutes of time it took me to actually find the article, read it, think it through, read a little bit more about the author and where it's being posted, to come to this realization that it's just a joke. The problem is that when you don't do this, as just a normal person, sharing things around social media or in blogs or in conversations with people, or worse, when you are a researcher or a young academic, a student in a bachelor or master's, you can actually end up circulating information that is either a gross misrepresentation of an idea or perhaps taken completely out of context, basically misrepresenting things and helping to spread misinformation or worse, disinformation. And I would just make
and that's even more problematic because that could create a cultural phenomenon. I mean, people could doesn't matter if it's fake news or not. This can create large groups of people, like echo chambers.
Exactly. And the problem, too, is that then some people seem to have more perceived authority. So if it's coming from a proclaimed expert in the field who hasn't really done their research and is misinforming people, which is maybe a bit more accidental, you did some sloppy research, you didn't really check where the source is coming from, who wrote it, what their intentions were behind it, that is pretty bad. But there's also then disinformation where you are knowingly going and putting forth things that are just blatantly wrong and using your credibility to enhance this. And this is where a lot of like the vaccines cause autism argument comes from, that there have been a few medical doctors who have claimed this is the case, but when you actually look into it, if you take the time to research that case, these people have lost their medical license.
There's nothing to it whatsoever.
It's complete falsehood, and these people are predicating disinformation, and now they're actually generating income from this disinformation. So they have an incentive to keep people believing the wrong thing as well, and we need to be very cautious of this as researchers.
And this has this with vaccines create autism. That one has been embraced by so many people that are very much into conspiracy theories, and especially it is kind of like a mix between New Age beliefs and conspiracy theories that we see a lot of spiritual people. And I am deeply spiritual, but that doesn't mean that I believe in conspiracy theories.
Totally. And
it's more about breathing right and that kind
just
of stuff.
looking into some of those, like, what for most people appears blatantly obvious that this is just a ridiculous worldview, you really need to kind of probe a bit deeper and figure out, well, what is the intention or the purpose behind that kind of comment, and maybe not the people who are perpetrating it as just, oh, well, this is what I believe, but the people who maybe actually stand to gain something from it. But I heard a really interesting defense side note here. When you encounter these sorts of conspiracy theorist people, instead of arguing with them, you can one-up them and see what they do. So, when somebody's like, oh, the moon landing was fake, you can look at them and say something along the lines of like, oh, so you're one of those people who believes that the moon is real.
Okay. Because I thought I thought like the Earth landing was fake. And I was like, we're just a projection.
Yeah.
And then we're really far off.
And see,
that's a possibility.
Yeah, see what they go and do with it. But anyways, all of these sorts of, jokes aside.
But what is a source? It's information taken from somewhere.
Yeah.
But it can be true and it cannot be true. It can be based on scientific research, or it cannot be. It can be someone talking about their life, or it can be someone interpreting their results from some kind of experiment. So it could be a lot of different things, but it's information taken from someone else, or somewhere else.
Yeah. And so there's a number of things that, if you really want to learn more about this and you are a student or an employee, go to your university library. These people really are the experts on helping you to do source assessment. But there's realistically, when you are doing any kind of research, literature reviews, background, information searching to get a better idea and understanding of something, or if you're doing highly specialized research as well, you're basically playing detective. You can't just read things and take things at face value. You need to be considering and asking a lot of other questions of the text. And this is a bit hard because a text isn't a conversation. You can't look at a source and ask it and get answers back from it. So you have to learn how to probe and try to determine some of these things yourself. So, the first one obviously would be, okay, what is this paper really about? Not just what the topic is, but how does it connect to research? What is sort of the intent or the purpose? And we've talked about that in another episode where we dissected an abstract, how to kind of figure out what a purpose is. So you can go check that out if you want more. But who's the author and what are their credentials?
And this is obviously important if we're talking about an academic source.
Definitely.
And I thought we could, like, a good starting point is an academic source is a source that has been peer reviewed. So what does that mean? What is it?
Is that a rhetorical question or an actual question?
It's an actual question. But I presented it like a rhetorical question with, the rhetorical hand.
I know. I was just waiting for the response.
No, but what is it?
Okay, so a peer-reviewed article, they're usually articles or possibly, a short review of something, a letter, original research of some sort, synthesis research, meta-analysis. But basically, peer review is a process where an author submits a piece of research or a communication, and it is read over. Usually it goes through a process, and they vary from place to place, but it'll come to an editor. An editor reads it over and makes a decision as to, well, is this something that we are interested in or not? If it is, then it goes through the review process where one or more people will read it. They will
It's usually a number of people.
Usually,
as far as I know.
Yeah, it does
usually.
Does depend on the structure of the journal and what their review process is. It might be a single blind, it could be a double blind, it might be unblind. Again, these are, if you're interested in publishing, you'll have to learn about this, and there's plenty of good resources that describe how this works. And most journals will tell you what their process is. But the review is basically that people within the field that should have some knowledge and some relevance towards what this paper is supposed to be about will review it. They will critically read it. They will make critical comments as to the relevance of it, the strength of the argument that is contained in there, the strength and credibility of the evidence that is being presented. It returns to the author, and the author then usually has to make necessary revisions to meet the standards. And when it's published, it basically means that, yes, this has been looked at by other experts in the field who are knowledgeable enough to make a judgment call about the quality of what you are reading.
So just to clarify a little bit, I talked about a professor working here, and we talked about the peer review process, and he was like, okay, so you send in some research, an article, and then let's say that some of the reviewers could say, you didn't specify where this compound was produced. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you need to include that.
Yeah.
Or was this distilled water, or was it not? It was not. Okay, then you probably need to do the experiment over again, because you might get different results. So this can be a long process, and it can be quite hard. And there's a lot of jokes within the scientific community about how bad culture it is when it comes to giving feedback. And it's not really constructive feedback in many cases. It's pretty much...
And a snail's pace that research tends to outstrip the rate of publications. And there's gatekeeper functions, and I mean, maybe that's for another episode where we could talk about sort of the role of peer review publication. But I think at least for what we're talking about today, as far as sources go, understanding that things that...
It's quality control.
It's a form of quality control, yes. And so that lends itself to some sort of credibility. Kind of like, that whole saying, I don't know so much about here, but, the whole like frat boy kind of culture in North America is like, hey man, pictures or it didn't happen. And that kind of ran off on its own thing of like, well, Jesus is a miracle worker. He walked on water. It's like, I don't see any photos of it. So
it didn't happen.
Yeah. So there's sort of like this, you need to demonstrate evidence, and people are going to demand that you rigorously find and use appropriate evidence, and that the evidence is actually evidence and not something fabricated. And that's more or less the idea of peer review, is that it should go through something of a several step process before it gets published and says, yes, like seal of approval, this is trustworthy information. Now, and
exactly.
That's of course,
so it's quality control to a certain extent, and it's a very important principle within science. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can't just come up with some outlandish claim and get it published.
No. You need to
get feedback from other people within your field.
You need to convince people that it's real. And the idea behind that is essentially to, make it difficult for people who might be cooking their information, their data, basically falsifying things to try to get published and spread disinformation.
And just to really talk about sources here, this is the way a credible source is produced in a way. But for that source to even be accepted into, or for that article to be accepted into a journal, you need to base it on credible sources. Mm-hmm. You can't just pick and choose whatever you like. No. You can't cherry pick.
Yeah, you need to have basically a really good way to tell if something is an academic or a scholarly source or a peer-reviewed source is, does it contain references, citations? It might also be called a bibliography. That will demonstrate that at least they are showing you where they are getting information and evidence from, be it theories, be it quotes, be it facts, numbers, data sets, that sort of thing. But the difference of it being peer-reviewed is to basically see, does it come from a scientific or academic journal that you can go and look up, and you should be able to read about it, and they'll say very often right on their homepage or on their mission statement or the About Us page that they are a peer-reviewed journal, and you can read about how they go through the process of peer review for their standards.
But it's not always that obvious.
No.
Because let's say you have a book. It's not always obvious that this is peer-reviewed, the contents in the book. Mm-hmm. But what you can look at is the publisher.
Yes.
Because the publisher should be specialized in academic or scientific works. And sometimes it's connected to a university. Mm-hmm. So and they're usually peer-reviewed. They have that's a part of their process.
Yes.
And the publishing process.
And so you could kind of put it as, there's a couple different categories of sources. So, we talked about the peer-reviewed, scholarly, academic sources, of which there's also, non-reviewed stuff that would fall under that. So if you are working on someone else who's working on another manuscript and sharing some ideas or data from there, they're probably also pulling from other sources. But then what you've mentioned, Niklas, is this non-academic source or a popular source. So books. Textbooks are a really good example of this, where they have been edited, and they've probably been edited by authors and an editor who are of some relevance to what's going on in the book. So especially if you're trying to pull knowledge out, a book on biology, intro to biology, intro to microeconomics, intro to genetic structures. You're probably going to see titles associated with some of these authors, maybe Masters of Science, PhD, something like that. The editor will probably also have a title associated with them. So it gives you an idea of some form of quality control, but we wouldn't necessarily consider this to be an academic source because it lacks that peer review process. But these sources are still valuable bits of information, and they tend to come out, and you need to then assess sort of what is the purpose of a text as well, not just who has written it, where is it appearing, and what is the process that got it there, but also what is the overall purpose? Because a textbook is not really designed to misinform you. It's designed to be a fairly general overview of what is currently happening. Just like encyclopedias, not technically a scholarly source, but it's a good way to go and get basic information.
It's like an overview of something.
Newspapers as well are a non-academic source. And again, it's what's the purpose of the story? Where is it being published? What form of kind of quality control does it go through? And I would even go so far as to say an important thing to look at is, if you are uncertain of whether you can trust that newspaper, do they regularly update stories and do error correction? So,
because that's something that you can see.
Yes.
I mean, I've been accessing some articles for some lectures that I've been doing, and then you can see, this is Norwegian newspapers, but you can see that, okay, this wasn't edited after it was published, but this one has been edited multiple times. Mm-hmm. And let's say only a month ago, even though the article was published a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
So it depends. But just to summarize a little bit, when looking at a source, first of all, you should try to determine if it's peer-reviewed or not. And you could also look at the credentials of the writer. That means that they should have like an academic degree that is relevant for the research or the information in the source relevant to. And sometimes, it's something that, let's say they have a PhD in microbiology, and this is about microbiology, and it's about what they specialized in. And sometimes it's not. It's more like, let's say, an introduction to biology, and it's written by someone who's specialized in something different, but it's at least within the same discipline.
Exactly.
And then the publisher should be a professional publisher. It doesn't have to be specialized on academic writing, but it could be, and sometimes it's connected to a university or some kind of institution that is doing research. And is there anything more?
Yeah, I think that's a good summary so far. There's a third category which a lot of people are probably familiar with but don't understand the technical term for it, and that's what we would call gray literature. And so this is unlike peer-reviewed literature that has gone through a certain process to be published and have a certain level of quality control, or unlike a more popular non-academic source like an internet article, an encyclopedia, a textbook, newspaper articles, news interviews, things like that. Gray literature is something that fits a bit in between. They're generally seen as a form of academic publication that has not been published commercially and has probably not gone through the same rigorous peer review process that would result in publication in a scientific journal. And a lot of this stuff then is any type of institutional report, a government report, a report from a non-governmental organization or consultancy or business firm, a research institute report, any official proceedings, typically from things that you would find in government regulations. So if you're interested in looking at environmental impact assessments, for example, you can get, meeting summaries of consultation processes and duties to consult, all of that sort of stuff.
Or it could be about oil drilling in the north,
yes.
Done by Equinor.
Yes.
Or something like that.
And then lastly, master's, theses, PhD dissertations. So these are things that there's a level of trustworthiness to them because they were conducted as a form of research or as a form of kind of official reporting on an event. And they fall under an institution that should have some sort of salience and credibility behind them. Now, you'll want to be careful, of course, because can you necessarily trust an official government report from, say, the Russian government or the American government?
Exactly, because a lot of these things could be strongly influenced by politics.
Yes.
So whatever they're writing about could be from a specific viewpoint. You told me something about this before this podcast. You're reading some kind of article about...
So I can give you an example of all three of these in some recent readings that I have been doing. I've been reading a lot of peer-reviewed journals that oftentimes they're much shorter, 8 to 15 pages, focused on a single topic. And now I'm looking at the oil sands in Alberta. So wetland rehabilitation and reclamation. A couple of articles on that. They've gone through the peer review process. They're pretty dense. They're fairly specialized. Lots of technical language that I have to navigate and try to figure out. Then there's a lot of non-academic sources. I've just found a book on the history of conservation and reclamation legislation. A whole lot of nominalization there, which basically covers about the last 120 years of policy changes in the province of Alberta in Canada. This is the non-academic source as a book. It's just providing a history. It's pointing to facts. It does contain references and citations, but it's just been written by a group of people who have worked in that industry. It's been edited and released, I think, by I can't remember who the publisher is. I don't think it's based off of a university, but they're fairly well known for wanting to produce kind of textbook material. And then the third one, a Gray Literature Review, which is an official report to a certain committee or subcommittee of the Government of Canada, which is reviewing as much of the gray literature as possible. So sort of the non-peer-reviewed research that is yet to be published, official government documents, as well as a lot of master's and PhD theses on oil sands projects. And what is very important, I think, is that as you're going through all of this is to do more than just assess, okay, who is the author and what is the topic, but what is their purpose? And for example, the non-academic source, the book that I'm reading, it kind of brushes over some seemingly very important parts of legislation and legal interactions at the Canadian constitutional level, particularly when it comes to Indigenous rights. And basically what I've read is it's summarized to a single paragraph. And so these people, they're not really interested in getting into a much more complex legislative and political web of the system it's embedded within. Okay, so
because that can sabotage their projects, or compromise it.
And it seems so far that the main message is, well, things were not so good in the past, but they're better today. And even if they're not better today, they'll be better tomorrow. We're continuously learning from the lessons. But it's also very much around kind of the science-based approach, the natural science approaches. And so that's the intent of this book, that it really seems like it's been written for people coming into conservation and restoration ecology and just giving them a rundown of where are we today. But we're not going to talk about all of these subsets of problems that the gray literature is talking about.
Another thing which I just... let's take American politics as an example. You see a lot of these political analysis, which are, on CNN and stuff, and a lot of them are based on rather good sources. But they cherry pick a little bit, and sometimes they can try to turn the they leave things out and they emphasize other things to support their political viewpoints and their political project, and everything to slam Trump, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't really matter if they pick out the things that doesn't fit or that. So this is something to be aware of. I think it happens in science as well.
Exactly.
But a lot of it.
That realistically, to come up with the most informed opinion and the best possible understanding that you can requires reading multiple different perspectives and trying to sort of like mentally triangulate, well, if these people have said this, but these people say that, and this third party is saying something different, you wouldn't get this much more complex web of interaction if you were just reading only one stream of communication. And I mean, in one way, it can kind of make you a bit distrustful because you have to try to figure out who you can trust. So an example from this gray literature report that I had just been reading earlier this week, a lot of it is talking about how, at least in the Albertan oil sands context, there is such a relationship between the industry and the goals of the provincial government. And I'm not going to go into the ethics or the politics behind whether these decisions are right or wrong. But basically what was happening is that in one circumstance, a government regulatory body was falsifying documents or were receiving falsified documents from the oil company, which stood in contrast to a bunch of public reports of terrible smells and leakage. And so basically industry and government for several years covered up a severe environmental problem with a leaking, I believe it was a natural gas well, before they were finally caught. And so,
like a reservoir underground.
It was just one or two sentences. I could pull up the source if I've got my papers. I've got my papers scattered somewhere. You just have to believe me. It's a report called Taking Research Off the Shelf, published in 2017 by the author is Tara Jolly and I believe Clint Westman. So go look that up. I've just given you where it is. I can't recall the page, but that also calls into question then, okay, this gray literature is it very much has a certain slant to it about we're not taking local populations and indigenous knowledge systems and people's lived experience into account in how we regulate the oil industry in Alberta. And they're using this as evidence to say that this is also a cause of why there's so much distrust in certain populations, because we have evidence of the government colluding to cover up something that is a public health and environmental health hazard.
Another thing which, I mean, just we talked about this other source before we started the podcast, and there's a book called something in social hegemony or something like that, but it's written by Laclau and Mouffe, which are both political theorists. I think Laclau is from Argentina and Mouffe is from Belgium or something, or the other way around. But they're both political theorists, and this book is about, they kind of present this theoretical framework like for discourse analysis, but it's very much influenced by their political viewpoints, because it's all about dismantling power structures and exposing hegemonies and stuff like that. So this is something that you need to be aware of when you use their theoretical framework, and you might want to alter it a little bit because you don't want your research to be that strongly influenced by politics. And in this case, it's obviously left. Doesn't really matter. The point is that when I used some of their concepts, I wasn't interested in painting my project in these political, with their political viewpoints. And so I kind of had to neutralize that a little bit.
And that's a good point you bring up, that there is going to be a bias in any kind of text that you read. It might not be overt, it might not be problematic, but that's part of assessing a source. Why is it credible, and why do you believe it? And what is it that they're saying? What's the intention or the bias or the message that is really behind it? And how explicit is it? If they tell you what their bias is and it's fairly apparent, then you're aware of that throughout. But it's these sort of hidden,
but if they don't,
these sort of hidden biases. And that's where I would definitely...
And this is a theoretical framework.
Yeah.
So it's not really something that they directly address.
Exactly. It's just embedded in there and kind of taken for granted. We have a couple professors at NMBU who are really focusing on this sort of thing. And that was the philosophy course of theirs that I took in June. Rani Lil Anjum. I'm not sure how you pronounce her last name, and Elena Roca from the economics department. They're writing a lot of this stuff, but more from like a scientific philosophy standpoint. But we have to recognize as researchers, especially if you're in the social sciences or in any kind of inter or multidisciplinary environment, you're probably going to have to pull from some of these non-academic sources and understand what's the political bias behind it, what's the social bias, what's the economic bias. And kind of being able to figure that stuff out as you read is a really big part of evaluating your sources to see if, one, it's useful, two, you think it's credible and reliable as evidence for whatever you're using it for to support the claim or to act as a counterclaim.
Another thing which also can be difficult is, especially as a student, one thing is if you're a professional researcher, it can probably be difficult for them as well, but if there's a piece of literature, let's say something written by Foucault or something written by another legend, one of the greats, right? There's something about stuff that they've written that it kind of gets immune to criticism. Or at least some people think that, who are you to say something about this?
Oh, yes.
He's a great thinker. But all these things were written within a specific historical context. And it's not like everything they thought and wrote about is something that you can apply to today's situation. And this, I think this just shows how important it is to be critical of academic sources, and even the ones that are, a part of the scientific canon. Yeah. Can you say that?
Yeah, the classics, if you will.
The classics, exactly. And so it's kind of like a balancing act, because you're not going to be able to push science forward if you're not criticizing what happened before and kind of evaluating if this is something that is that can be used now or not. And it's maybe easier within the natural sciences because we're talking about numbers and things that you could say, okay, they didn't take this into consideration. But you could also do it within the social sciences. Maybe there's a perspective that this great thinker forgot or didn't think about.
Exactly.
That happens.
And so I think within that, there are two things that are worth addressing. The context, where this information came from, is quite important so that it fits, but also evaluating sources based off of how you will use them. What is the type of paper or manuscript or stance that you are taking? Are you forming an argument? And is this something that is supportive of your argument or that you are going to try to counter? Like, are you debating it? Is this useful as something that is part of a background or a history that helps us to understand where we are today and your stance on the topic? And yeah, being able to have that little bit of criticism as well, because what we're doing is needing to contribute to the advancement of scientific and philosophical theories, depending on your department. And with that later part of the contribution, I think it's also really important to recognize the difference between when you should or should not use primary or secondary sources. So this is something I think we should spend a moment of time describing. Do you want to do it or do you want me to?
Definitely. I mean, it's fun that you brought this up because I was just looking over my notes and we got to talk about this. This is important. Yeah. Okay, so talking about primary source. A primary source could be Foucault's own writing, right? Or it could be what Plato wrote. That's a primary source. But everybody that tries to explain what this person wrote, that would be the secondary source.
Yes. And in the natural sciences, we would consider, even in the social sciences, a primary source could also be considered any original piece of research where they're using their own data. So when you're looking, more at these sort of classical pieces, if you will, and reading the treatise or the thesis of some of these really big names, their books, their articles, their publications, those would, yes, definitely be considered a primary source. But also any original data that's coming out of your own discipline. That is,
so it could be your PhD or a master's thesis for that sake, or a bachelor's thesis.
Yes, that's a form of primary source material based off of kind of the new generations, the new knowledge, or the new data. However, a secondary source would then be when you are using somebody else's material as evidence to support you. And so this is where, obviously, when you see a citation in somebody's work that isn't a direct quote, so a paraphrase, basically, you're at a point where it becomes a secondary source. You're reading somebody's interpretation of somebody else's information. And what
someone else's invention, someone else's ideas. The important thing here is that there's a couple of things that can happen. One is that they misunderstand what was in the original source, so the secondary source is wrong.
Or
it doesn't really say what.
Or misinforming, basically.
Misinforming, yes. Or it could be a misunderstanding of what's in the primary source, or it could be a recontextualization of the idea. So one example is, this is something we talked about before, but there's a literature theorist and philosopher called Mikhail Bakhtin. He's Russian. And he was coming up with these concepts in how to analyze literature and the different voices that influences your writing or someone's writing, all the different pieces of information that are stitched together to create a narrative and a story. Anyways, I was reading a book about pedagogy, and there's this professor talking about that you could use his theory as a way to, let's say that there are students or pupils in a classroom, and you've just been talking about the French Revolution, right? Let's say a couple of days ago, and you ask one of the students about something concerning the French Revolution, and then they speak to you, and you can almost hear yourself. You can hear your word choicing, and this is all about, you can hear your voice within their voice. But that's just one way to use his theory. So the point is that this professor recontextualized his ideas to fit pedagogy. And this is something that you need to be aware of. And the reason for that is his theory, his concepts are much more complex than that and can be used for so many other things than this specific thing.
And so that's where you're basically, the recontextualizing, rethinking, adapting somebody's theories or ideas is useful to extend the conversation and to advance ideas in a similar or even different field altogether. And that can be a very good use of a primary source. Then when you read that person who is quoting the original or paraphrasing the original, you just need to be aware that perhaps there has been a change that has occurred and the idea is different now than what
so you could use both.
Yeah.
Go to the primary source and then maybe that the secondary source has some interesting ideas. So you could definitely use them both, but remember to go to the primary source.
And I would say there's two other ways that a secondary source could end up being used. So we've talked about one which is basically misinforming, not taking things into context, misquoting, just kind of accidental. And one of the problems with that is basically then if you are citing or referencing the secondary source who made the mistake, you're perpetuating a mistake. You're continuing misinformation. So you should, like you had said, kind of go back to that primary source and check that as well. So it's a little bit more homework for you. There's the reconceptualizing or advancing or extending the idea. Then I would say that there is sort of the critique or criticism where a secondary source relying on the primary source is pointing out flaws or problems or things that it doesn't account for.
And putting it in a bad light, basically.
And so then when you read that, you're reading a primary source that is using another primary source. So it's both a primary and a secondary source. And then, of course, there's just the fourth way, which is to simply cherry pick things to such a point where it really has no connection. And
it's taken out of context.
It's so far out of context that it almost becomes disinformation because you're not appropriately representing the original idea. So you might...
I have two cool examples for that.
Yeah, go for it.
And one is there's an American philosopher, psychologist, and educator called John Dewey. He's real big within pedagogy. And... most people know him for learning by doing. That's something that he supposedly said and wrote. But that's not true. And the funny thing here is that there's so many teachers that have based their career on learning by doing. Okay, so I need to, the students or the pupils, they need to get out and they need to do things, build houses, do experiments, all kinds of things. The problem is that that's not what he said. But no one bothered to check the primary source. What he actually said is, because I found this, learn to know by doing and to do by knowing. So this is also translated into learn by doing and reflection. Learning by doing and reflection. So the reflection part is
just totally omitted.
Forgot about.
Yeah.
And
then it's sort of brought back as somebody else's
not really
idea
important.
later, or things that get thrown out of the fold.
But this had real consequences because there were pupils that went through, let's say, 7 years of primary school in Norway, and all they did was learning by doing, but no reflection.
Yeah.
Well, that's too bad, right?
Yeah.
Just a bunch of experiments with no purpose.
Yeah.
No, like, why did we do this? How can we apply this to something else?
Deeper
no,
analysis.
they just had like group work, making stuff out of clay. No one understood anything.
And this isn't anything new either, and I think that's why it's so important to be assessing so many different aspects of a source. And when you encounter these sorts of secondary sources where you're reading someone's interpretation of somebody else's idea, or when you start seeing according to so-and-so as cited in another reference, where then you get to what's called a tertiary source. They're very rare, but that is basically when someone can't find the primary source, the original person who said or did something or produced some data or information, that they have to rely on the secondary source. Maybe it's an access issue. Maybe the university or the company and whatever that the institution they work at doesn't have access to the journal where the original information is held. You're putting a lot of trust in another person's interpretation of someone else's work, and then
which you don't even know exists.
Yes, which you can't find to verify. And then you are citing someone who is citing someone else, and then I come along and read it as the fourth person, and maybe I get lazy and don't bother to look at the original secondary source as cited in so-and-so. So then if I take these ideas, it kind of becomes like that game of telephone. Did you call it the same thing in Norwegian where you sit in a circle and you whisper something in someone's ear and they whisper to the next? You just call it
viskeleken, the whisper game.
Yeah, that's what it's called, yeah. And by the time it kind of comes back to you, it's like, that is so far off
What is this? Have you seen
what I ever said originally?
This is an old Mel Brooks movie. Have you seen Men in Tights?
Yeah, the Robin Hood one? Yeah,
Robin Hood parody. And I think this is like the at the end of the movie, it's like the end titles, right? And finally Robin Hood got the key to Lady Marian's chastity belt. And it doesn't fit or something, right? And you hear he's like, call the locksmith. And you can hear all these people shouting, call the locksmith around the village. And it just changes into something completely different. It's it just ends like that. So it's the same thing. I talked to, we know her, Bettina from the library, Bettina Offner. She's like a librarian specialized in... What is she specialized in? This is kind of embarrassing.
I know not her specialization, but just that her work is tied, kind of like we do, to try to link the work of the library to other departments and other universities. What her actual area of specialization is, you could find her on the NMBU employee
I think information
catalog.
Searches or something. I'm not sure, but that's not relevant. The point is that she told me that this scenario where you can't find the primary source happens quite often, actually. And the thing is that sometimes it doesn't even exist. And she's seen, that it's quoted in, for example, it could be a published article in like a respected journal or in books. Like this source doesn't exist, and sometimes it can go full circle back to it's just invented.
Yeah, or. You also need to realize that we might be pulling on sources from places that, you're right, they no longer exist. Journals just stop being journals if they don't have funding, if they don't have enough editorial staff, if it just gets to be too much work, if they're subsumed into some other larger journal. And whose responsibility is it to make a whole backlog of who knows how many years or decades of information digitally available? Like that's a big job for an organization that might not exist anymore.
And then it's just lost in space, and lost in time.
And historic documents as well that just simply may never have been digitized. There are a number of reasons why you might not be able to find a primary source. And then it ultimately, I think, comes down to a judgment call. Do you trust the secondary source that you are looking at to use that primary source, or is this primary source even relevant? Can you maybe find someone else or some other primary source that supports what's being said and cite that one so that you are the secondary source instead of a tertiary source?
So what other advice could we give to the students? If you can't find the primary source and you have to base everything on a secondary source, maybe you should just take it out.
Possibly,
if you can't find something
if there's nothing else, because what was this idea? I've been watching PBS Eons recently, and this seems like it's going to be a little bit off topic, but It's basically like a geological, paleontological channel. That's been my groove for the last couple of weeks, diving into that. But they have something, I think it was called and don't quote me on this because I could be wrong, convergent evolution or concurrent evolution, which is basically when completely separate species spring up with similar body plans, similar ecological niches at similar times or even at much later times, but they look so similar to each other that you think they're related, and they're not.
The design is similar.
Yes.
Okay.
And so the same sorts of things can happen within design, within thought, within research. There's that whole debate of whether or not
mythology
was the diesel engine invented before the petroleum internal combustion engine, and they happened around the same time. So who had the idea first? And they're incredibly similar. They function just off of a different fuel. And those were independently
the chances
developed. So there's a chance that somewhere else you'll probably find that very similar information that's not relying on that primary source. But if you keep seeing that primary source that you can't access again and again and again, and the interpretations are generally the same, then you can probably trust to cite one of those secondary sources that you're relying on.
This kind of touches upon, I mean, we talked about this before when it comes to music and plagiarism and, you know, people coming up with more or less the same idea at different places at the same time. I mean, it happens, and there's a lot of people. So
yeah,
there's a lot of people interacting with each other, thinking many thoughts. So it's not too unreasonable that you should be able to find some kind of information that you could use instead.
Yeah.
But
so I would say try that first and just
try that first.
That's a form of quality control. Are you just kind of seeing the same thing and that same primary source occur again and again and again, and relatively unchanged? If so, it's probably reliable to use it in a secondary source, so that you're citing the person who is citing the original work, even though you can't access it. Now,
I also think that I've been reading some kind of article or a book, and there's something that I find interesting and I want to use myself, and I can't find the source. Like, there's a source there, but it doesn't lead to anything. And I know people that would just like, okay, I'll just include the same source. You know, I'm not going to bother finding it because I'm probably not going to be caught doing it. And I think I'm just so suspicious that I think the article that I read, I sometimes I think that person did the exact same thing.
It could be.
They just tried to get away with it.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I can't really find the source, but just like I just steal it from someone else's literature list, and you know, no one will notice.
And I was going to say that more or less that exact same thing in different words. Basically, what is the reason why you can't find that primary source that seems so important? Is it that you read it in someone's reference list and you pull it up and Google Scholar or Web of Science or whichever database you are using to do most of your searching in, it doesn't appear there? If that's where you stop, you're not that good of a detective. There's got to be other ways that you can do this. Okay, so where was it published? Can I go and find that journal? Maybe it's simply an access problem. Your university and the library's association with certain journals doesn't exist. You can go to the library and they are willing to get you access to these journals that they don't currently have access to for free.
Or you could try to send the author an email. If the author is alive,
yes,
of course.
Or if they're still working there. So then it kind of becomes trying to track that person down. So that is exactly the other thing that you could do. Maybe you need to contact the secondary source
publisher,
author.
That could be.
Yeah, contact them. Hey, I'm trying to find where you got this information from. Sometimes they have things that are just unpublished. They're friends with these other researchers, and they put it down because it's going to be published somewhere. Maybe not in a peer-reviewed journal. Maybe it goes to a university repository. I have a couple documents like that. And
sometimes it never happens.
And they're written and they're digitally stored somewhere, but they're never like officially published. And so I have some documents that are like that I've been relying on, where you kind of need to know the person and you have a full citation, but if somebody goes looking for that, they're going to kind of pull up a bit of a blank. Or they're
going to meet a wall.
Or they might find the information, but it's inaccessible to them. So you have to ask yourself, can I get it can the library help me out and the librarians get me access to this journal and then I can retrieve it and read it myself? Or can I contact the original author, the primary source, or can I contact the secondary author? Because in this case, I will be the secondary citation on some of these reports that you can find the title of it somewhere, but it doesn't lead you anywhere. So you'd have to know how to get in contact with that author to get that report, or else it's probably titled and stored in a searchable database under a different name that just doesn't reflect the standards that I am using within my academic environment. It might be a report number that is just granted to it. It's a series of alphanumeric symbols that if you don't know what those are in a government repository, you're not going to find it. So you got to be a bit more diligent, basically, is what I'm saying.
Oh yeah.
Don't take no for
what
an
about
answer.
What about all these other sources? So the non-academic sources. I'm talking about newspapers. I'm talking about blogs, videos, interviews. Is that okay to use? And let's say that it depends on what you're working on.
I would say it depends entirely upon what you are working on, and it also depends on where is it being fit in. Let's say that you are writing in a field that I'm somewhat familiar with, ecology, and you want to start out in your introduction and link, a fairly socio-political problem related to the ecological research that you have been doing. You could start out in your introduction and cite, recent developments, as published here, the news organization that broke the story, or a government report, or an environmental consultancy group who has reported on something.
Or just an interview with a person saying, this is horrible, our livelihood is stolen from us because of this and that.
That establishes a sort of a context, and it's probably most useful in something like your introduction. I wouldn't necessarily, that's not your result, so it shouldn't go in your results section, obviously.
But it depends on what you do.
It definitely depends on what you do. It depends on your field of research, and it also depends on, is this primary data that you are using? So if you collected those interviews and you're using quotes from it, those are your results. So you can use them.
That's what you're.
Yes.
That's what you're analyzing.
Exactly.
Let's say, just take an example. If you want to analyze how conspiracy theories spread on Instagram, you will have to go onto people's pages, look at comments, and that will be your primary source.
Exactly.
And that's going to be what you analyze. But you're going to use different concepts to understand how this is production of a specific culture, for example.
Exactly. Now, this is certainly more within the social sciences than you're going to see in the natural sciences. So for those of you in microbiology, veterinary studies, economics...
This is not relevant for you.
It's probably not something that's going to come up. But it doesn't mean that it can't be useful. Perhaps in your introduction or in your conclusion, there's just a really good quote that comes from a newspaper or a politician or some well-known person that helps to set the stage and develop the context. And your research isn't heavily dependent on it. But, there are a lot of students from the International Relations Department who are really heavily into discourse analysis and text analysis. So, of course, they're sitting there reading newspaper reports. And, I mean, it becomes scientific because you're applying methodologies. And so it's okay to use them and to cite them as a large part of the sources that you use, but you have to analyze them. You can't necessarily just use it as evidence to support a claim. You need to link it to a theory that helps to explain it. You need to demonstrate how you analyzed it to kind of turn it in a way into evidence, quote unquote.
And if it's only one person saying something, it's kind of uninteresting because people say all kinds of crazy things. It has to be, let's say that you interview 10 people and then you use a bunch of different sources, so you get some kind of an idea of, most people that decide to I'm just going to come up with some ridiculous example. Okay, go to Ayia Napa for some kind of recreational, spiritual vacation. What do they think about something. Meditation. It could be healthy eating. It could be anything. And then you will kind of get, okay, it seems like this is a dominant idea within that culture. So that could be a nodal point if you're using concepts from discourse theory.
Yeah.
Right?
So it's sort of the right tool for the right job. And of course, you can't rely entirely upon non-academic sources, because any academic or scholar or researcher who reads that, especially if it's going through the peer review, they're going to look and say, well, this isn't good enough. The quality of the information that you are providing here, we don't know if we can trust all of it. Yep. And you got to remember too, one reason for that is also that if you're using just a lot of, information from, a non-academic source, what is the quality control behind that? And will that original piece stay the way that it is so someone can actually go and investigate it themselves? Is it possible? And that's the problem with a lot of internet stuff, is it can get taken down, it can move, it can be edited, and you don't necessarily know by who or when. And so if you're relying on a lot of that and it doesn't come from a stable URL, which is why if you've ever read a lot of journals, they start coming with the DOIs, the digital object identifiers, and then you get this this alphanumeric code that basically goes to a repository, keeping that link stable forever. So if a journal folds, you can still follow this link and access it. So there's like these advancements that are being made to kind of have information recovery. But you also really need to be aware that these non-academic sources can change. And let's just use, for example, a book. If you're citing a book and that book is, the second edition, and you don't provide that information, and somebody goes and reads the first and can't find that information,
they're going to call you a
taken
liar.
Out. Or if they read the fourth version and that information has been redacted or edited as new changes in the field have occurred. So it becomes very important, not just to assess why you're using this and how it will be useful and if you trust it or not, but also when you cite it and reference it, that you're providing as much possible information, which we haven't really touched on how to reference, but the importance of it is...
But we talked about it in the plagiarism episode from last season.
So it's a
to a certain extent.
Yeah, so it's basically a breadcrumb trail, and you want that bread to be something that you want to turn that breadcrumb trail into like very clear signs that aren't going to be eaten by animals or disappear over time. You want to like make it out of stone and make it very clear and apparent where people can go to get this stuff. So
it's like traffic signs, right?
Mm-hmm. And
you don't want people to misunderstand
that. It's like
because
trying to navigate yourself away around Norway, where you guys just haven't really figured out how signs work.
Norway is so small that everybody knows where to go.
Yeah, exactly. I guess it's like we in Canada, we all just know each other, but we're good with the signs part, at least, because we don't necessarily
because
know how
Canada is huge. It's massive.
Yeah, we need those signs. But I would also just end up saying that that's another key that you can look for when you're evaluating sources is, does the author make it apparent where they're getting their information from? And when you read a really great, well-researched news article, they usually, especially if you're reading online, they have hyperlinks, the blue text that you can click on and it takes you to another article. If they don't have a lot of this stuff, and if they're not providing names, if they're not providing dates, if they're not providing any further information below demonstrating where this came from, I would really question it.
Of course, and you should. And you should always be skeptical to news articles and stuff anyways, because there's a journalist who's been writing it, so they have a tendency to, they have to be more bombastic to get more clicks on the internet.
Yeah. Now, I think that comes to one final point worth making too, is just because it appears in a peer-reviewed journal doesn't mean that it's of any quality, for a couple of reasons. The first one being the journal may be predatory. And are you familiar with that term? You've heard that? Okay,
no.
So
I heard it, but not in this context.
Predatory journals are essentially journals that pry on people's researchers' ideas, that they will say, hey, we invite you to come and contribute to our special edition. They like to spam your inbox, basically. They generally do not have a review process, or the review process they have is very weak. It's very quick to get published in them. They usually charge you a lot of money, and that's how they generate income for themselves. So there's no quality control, but they appear on the surface. They have a facade of being a real journal. And the Beals, so it's the Beals list. You can go and check that out. It got this researcher, can't remember his name, somebody Beal, Beall. He got in a lot of hot water for publishing a lot of names of journals that seemed to have predatory practices. And the website was taken down, but it's back up again. So you can go and type in a journal that you're interested in or pulling things from. And if it appears on this list, it might not have gone through the same quality control. So
you should steer away.
Exactly. So just because it's out there doesn't necessarily mean that it is something that you should trust, just because it's a peer-reviewed journal.
This seems very similar to, I know a lot of people in social media, they get contacted by some kind of company that, you want to be our brand ambassador. And they send you a bunch of stuff, and then you need to sell it, and you need to send them the money, and it's basically some kind of a pyramid scheme-esque type business model. It sounds a little bit like that, just within the academic world instead.
Or you'll see, the Instagram influencers, YouTube influencers who, they're given something or some small price to market something that is a very inferior product from a very questionable company. And these spokespeople sort of have authority and credibility to their audience, but they end up selling something that is of incredibly poor quality, possibly fraudulent. Like, this sort of stuff happens, and it's this new emerging issue out there for people worried about, business and marketing ethics and things like that. But this is a practice that has been going on within academia for quite a while. And there's also the issue of gatekeeping, that there's a lot of really great research that just doesn't get published because people, the editor, the reviewers just simply don't believe it. So here's another problem.
They don't like it.
Yeah, I mean... The theory of evolution was not particularly welcomed in when it was first presented, and plate tectonics.
There's a bunch of other examples.
Yeah, plate tectonics is one of them. The biotic pump theory, the one that's most recent in my mind.
But the trees pumping water into the inland?
Yeah, which was actually an idea developed by two Russian physicists, but they had to kind of... Nobody in physics would publish it because they're like, oh, this is absurd. Okay, well, we'll go to meteorology. No, like, we don't want to believe in it. And, you publishing this, we're going to ruin your career because it completely undoes our understanding of the hydrologic cycle. So it ended up finding its way into some disciplines of ecology where it's been like rapidly picked up and published. And now you have all of these other peer-reviewed journals that had denied them who are backpedaling on a lot of this and realizing, oh, now actually when we do review it, the math works out and this explains a whole lot of things. It was just so against their dogma. It was against the ideology and the established belief. So these are all issues that we need to end up navigating when we're trying to assess the quality of research,
So, but that's an interesting thing, because this also happens in lots of journals. Whatever you're writing about, it needs to be popular to a certain extent, right? People need to care about it. And you should have positive results.
Yeah.
Like, if you didn't find anything, people are not that interested in reading it. Maybe you mapped out something extremely important. Like, don't go there because you won't find anything.
Yeah.
And that was, very important for for future research. But you're not going to get your article published because it's not cool reading.
Yeah. That's maybe something worth talking about another day, the importance of negative results. I talk with my colleagues about it all the time, but at a different time and a different place, I assume. It's and
I think, if you don't talk about it now, it's still going to be all right.
that you can say again.
Yeah. All right.
This was a fun one. I'm glad that we did it. Niklas, thanks for, as always, a really great conversation around all of this.
Thank you so much. So much fun. And the first one that I recorded in my office.
Yeah.
Think about that.
There you go. The writing center is soon to open, or at least digitally open.
Yes, digitally open. So it's only going to be me in here with the sign. But
only you know where to find the writing center.
Yeah, hopefully not. I'm going to do my best to let everybody know.
Well, you can find us online, NMBU Writing Center.
And that's a reliable source, believe me.
I can vouch for it. Okay. Until next week, Niklas.
Thank you, Clayton.
Take care.
Until next week. Take care.